In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. Well, I do want to thank Father James very much for having me here to be with you. You can have a little pride. I wouldn't say it's pride well worth it, but you can have a little pride that this is the first retreat I've actually ever accepted. Because of the business of the parish, I really haven't accepted a lot. I've told my parish that I will accept 3 a year, and this is the first one because you have a very, very good priest, and so I wanted to come for that. I'll also tell you, he told you at the beginning that last night I told him, I said, you made 2 mistakes in the flyer. You called me an archpriest. I'm not. And you called me a scholar, and I'm far from a scholar. It's the bigger mistake. The reality is most of what I speak of and most of what I speak about are simply my mistakes. I'm actually very grateful to God that I've been such an idiot for so long, because I come to realize my own idiocy, and then a light bulb goes on and I go, oh, I've been looking at it this way. It's actually this way. And that's just helped me. It's helped me to teach, because it turns out that a lot of people end up making similar mistakes. And so a lot of what I speak about is just simply an explanation of my own mistakes and my own idiocy. And that's a lot of what I'll talk about today, really. So I want to start with a joke. You can stop me if you've heard it. I guess it's a pretty popular joke. It goes like this: why did the chicken cross the road? Well, every kid knows the answer to this, right? The answer is simply to get to the other side, and nobody laughs at this punchline. As a kid, I remember talking with my cousins and some friends, and we just talk, oh, this is the dumbest joke in the world. This thing is so stupid. Why is this even considered a joke? And then around the age of 8 or 9, I had a revelation one day. One of those light bulbs went on. And I realized that the punchline is only dumb if you expect it. If you expect a clever punchline and you hear to get to the other side, you actually realize that the joke was on you. The joke is a setup to make you believe that there's going to be something very clever. You expect a certain clever response. And as you anticipate that, you get this plain answer that's obvious. Why would anybody or anything cross a road but to get to the other side? So here I was at 8 or 9 years old, realizing that the joke in actuality is kind of funny in its expectations and subversions of those expectations. And I start with this because I think that in many ways orthodoxy is actually kind of similar to this idea. We ask profound questions and we expect to get very profound answers, and often the answers are really quite simple. But the simplicity in these answers actually hides this depth and wisdom that's a lot more profound than the initial words convey. So when Father James asked me to speak at the retreat and I asked him the topic, he sent me a text, and that was the text. He said, healing unto communion with God. And as a priest and as an Orthodox Christian, I admit I laughed. And I laughed out loud to nobody in particular, because I said, oh, he wants me to talk about everything. This topic is absolutely everything. I love that your parish has ladybugs all over the place. I mean, is this normal?
This is just the start.
This is just the start. Be free. This topic is everything. Everything the church believes, everything the church instructs, everything the church does is about this topic. And if we lose this topic, healing unto communion with God, then the church ceases to be the church. It's like telling a doctor to give a 2-part lecture, and when he asks, well, what do you want me to talk about? You say, well, sickness and healing. Okay. Keep in mind, this is not a criticism at all. It gave me a lot of freedom, so I was appreciative of the topic. But I thought, how am I going to narrow down this into two segments? And so what I thought I would talk about is, number one, what really is man's illness? How do we understand what man's illness actually is? And number two, rather than what it takes to be healed, what's the good mindset of a good patient? How do we have a proper mindset of healing within the church? So for the first talk, I want to, in order to know about true healing, we need to understand it. I want to talk about what man's illness actually is. And just like with why did the chicken cross the road, we get to the other side. So when we say in the Orthodox Church, what is man's illness? You won't find it very profound when I say sin. Sin's the problem. Big deal. First topic done. All right, we'll meet again in an hour and talk about the second. No, this answer actually contains a great hidden depth of profound wisdom that, when properly understood, it helps us understand what it truly means to be human and what it means to be a Christian. And actually, when we understand what sin is, and we then, by necessity, begin to understand what healing is, we actually find there's a lot of beauty to Orthodox theology. And it actually enlivens us. It fills us with true life inwardly because we understand what life is really about. So typically, when somebody asks this question, if we were to give a little bit of a fuller answer, what is man's issue in this life? We might give a threefold answer. We would say it's sin, the devil, and death. It's those three things together. But if you look at that, sin really is the root of everything. It's what gives the devil rights over us. And it's what leads to death in the first place, right? The wages of sin is death. So, again, we can look back at that analogy of a physician. A doctor might define illness as a state of disease, infection, or being unwell. And you could look at this and you could say, it took you 7 years of schooling and thousands upon thousands of dollars of education to answer that. But the understanding behind that answer really did take 7 years. And some of the realities of illnesses are so complex that a really good doctor is going to give various explanations and use various analogies to reveal different facets and concepts that are involved in that simple word illness. In the same way, the Orthodox understanding of the word sin involves looking at the concept of sin from many, many different angles, so that we have this vision almost as if through a prism, seeing sin from a very three-dimensional manner. And that's kind of what I want to accomplish today. That's what the goal is. To understand what causes man to be in need of healing in the first place, and to look at the simple term of sin and understand its nature and its hold on us a little bit more fully. Now, why is this so important in the first place? One more analogy, okay? When I was younger, probably around middle school age, I had this small light bulb go on. It wasn't about theology, it was about math. I was in math class one day, and I started to see the equals sign in a different way than I had before. Up until that point, when I saw a math equation and I saw the equal sign meant, what is the answer? Or this is the answer. So 3 plus 4 equals meant 3 plus 4 is what answer? And that's how I read this. But that's not what an equal sign is. An equal sign doesn't mean the answer is, but rather is the same as or the same value as. And that little tiny change in conception for the equal sign caused me to see math equations not as seeking an answer, but seeking a balance. How can I make sure that the value on one side of the equation is the same as the value on the other side of the equation? And suddenly math started to make much more sense, especially algebraic formulas and methods. Everything started to make more sense. Simple change in concept, but it changed the way that I looked at these equations altogether, and suddenly math became a lot easier for me. It's really the same with the concept of sin. When our concept of sin is fuller and more precise, our understanding of man's health and the process of healing is also refined. Just like an equal sign, we have to balance it on both sides of the equation. We begin to see the spiritual life much more clearly. So typically, when we hear the concept sin, when we hear that word, what do we typically hear it as? Most people hear the word sin, and they think sin means to do something bad. And we kind of leave it at that. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the first problem I would say is that it's a decidedly legal and juridical definition of sin. Basically, the idea is God expects right behavior. When we act against his expectations and his law, then we've sinned. And that's what sin ultimately is. But this presents Christianity really mainly as a system of right beliefs and moral behavior and nothing more. There's a problem with that. Much of the West has accepted this view, even if not explicitly or dogmatically. It's become a very popular understanding of Christianity. And thus atheists will often say this. I'm sure you've heard atheists say this. Maybe you've been an atheist and said this at some point in your life. I don't need a God to tell me to be a good person. I don't need a God to show me how to be a good person. I'm not going to go into that, by the way. That could be a topic in itself. There's a lot of problems, though. I'll just let you know. There's 3 big problems with that statement. Number 1, it limits God to a mere moral lawgiver. That's not all God is for us. Number 2, it inherently sees sin merely as doing something bad. That's what we'll talk about today. Number 3, it assumes an objective definition for what the words good and bad mean, even though there's no objective source for those things. If anyone ever says that to you, I don't need a God to tell me to be a good person, ask them, objectively, tell me what good is. Objectively, not subjectively, not from your perspective. Give me an objective view of the word good. And if they give you any definition, you can say, well, I could find somebody who disagrees with that, and therefore there's no objective definition. The whole thing falls apart. But that's an aside. Let's go back to that equal sign. With the concept of not doing bad things being the definition of sin, then righteousness equals not doing bad things. If you don't do bad things, then you are a righteous person, a righteous Christian. It's a pretty far cry from the gospel call and Christ's call to us. Christ doesn't say, try not to do bad things, and then you'll have righteousness, you'll have great riches in heaven. No, what he says in Matthew 5:48 is, therefore you shall be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. That idea, to be righteous just means don't do bad things. A far cry from 2,000 years of saints who weren't satisfied with merely not doing bad things. So clearly the Christian life is not just based in not doing bad things. So what is the Christian mindset? Well, you heard it in the theme of this retreat, right? The healing of the soul. Well, again, we have to take a step back and we ask, what does that mean? I was in a master's counseling program. I never finished it out, I was too busy with the parish, but we learned very early on that there were 2 models that a therapist and really a physician can use, 2 different models. There's what's called the illness model or the health model. The illness model simply looks at the illness and says, what can we do to get rid of the symptoms of this particular illness? Maybe we'll get to the root of it. Maybe we just need medication that masks over the problems. A health model seeks to bring a person to an actually healthy state. It's a very, very different idea. If somebody comes to me or Father James for some sort of counseling, if all we want to do is get rid of the problem, it doesn't necessarily lead them to a healthy approach to life and a healthy mindset. It's better to work off of this health model. And the Orthodox idea is to bring man unto spiritual health, not just get rid of the spiritual illness. So a man who is not sinning, in other words, is not necessarily a healthy person. It's really important to understand that. Just because somebody is not actively sinning does not mean that they are in a state of spiritual health. There may be an inner healing that still needs to happen, and we would consider that person, without being infused with righteousness, which means really having embodied the virtues and being filled with grace, we would consider this person to still be beset by sin, even if sin wasn't outwardly manifesting itself. You can have a person who's not outwardly sinning and is a perfectly nice person and say that this person is still living in sin. And hopefully you're starting to understand when we say this, the Orthodox concept of sin is not really all that judgmental compared to how it's often perceived. To say that someone's living in sin, a lot of people look, how dare you judge me? Well, no, all that means is that we're not living what? In communion with Christ. That's all it means. It's all of us. So what's the typical definition of sin that we get from the Greek? Armatia. I'm sure you've heard this, right? What does it mean? Missing the mark. Yeah, to miss the mark. Okay. So you think about what that means. Okay. If Christ is the mark, I guess you should go to this side. If Christ is the mark, The aim of my life in thought, words, and deeds is to be directed towards Christ such that whatever I say, do, or think is not out of line with what he desires for my life. It's in communion with him. It's in him, it's through him, he's in me, through me. To sin means to miss the mark, which means I could miss it by a little. I can make a little small sin. I have a little thought for a second that strays away from a truly virtuous and righteous path. Or I can sin greatly and completely turn my back to Christ and look completely the other way. What does this do when we engage in this? And what's our life really like? I mean, the reality is that I suspect I'm not alone in this. I don't feel like my life is very steady, this close to Christ or this. I feel like I'm this, like all day long. I'm looking at him one moment, I'm away from him, then I look back, and then I look way over the other way, and then I go back to him. This is what sin does, is sin makes us seem almost schizophrenic in the spiritual life. We're bouncing all over the place throughout the day. There's no internal peace. I started looking, I tend to think of myself as a pretty mellow, pretty stable, emotional person. I grew up in a nice German family. Germans, like we don't have emotions. We don't allow that, right? So it's not allowed. Everything's very stoic. But when I started thinking about this more in my life, I started looking at myself throughout the day and went, oh my goodness, I'm all over the place. I wake up groggy and maybe a little irritable. And then like one little good thought comes to me and suddenly I'm energized and I'm ready to go. And then this other thought hits me and I'm depressed and I feel hopeless. And then another thought hits me and it makes me tired and I just want to go to bed. And then this other thought hits me and suddenly I'm driven and I think, well, there's a problem and I'm going to really... And by the end of the day, if you really look at yourself, you go, I'm all over the place. And it's not just emotionally. Psychologically, spiritually, we're all over the place. Whenever I do spiritual reading, especially about a great life of a saint, I read about their asceticism and I go, oh man, this is me, I'm going to do this. I've learned by now to go, but in 5 minutes I'm not going to feel that way. I told my parish this past week, I said, make sure you make a good plan for Great and Holy Lent. Have a good plan. But it needs to be a dual plan. You need a plan for how you want to live this Lent and how you want to deepen your spiritual life, and then a plan for when your zeal is completely gone and you don't want to do it and how you're going to get yourself back on track or keep yourself on track. You need to prepare for that. It's not going to last. The good feelings of the spiritual life don't last. They don't last for weeks. They don't last for days. For me, they don't last usually much more than a couple minutes. We need to prepare. So what's happening? Again, sin causes us to be bouncing all over the place internally. Why is this? Why is it that our thoughts and our feelings and our impulses are flying all over the place all the time? Well, again, Orthodox theology actually teaches about this, and it teaches what the root of this is. And it uses this word that you've probably come across, the word nous, often translated as mind. You can think of nous as the focus of the soul. The focus of the soul is restless. The soul's constantly bouncing all over the place. In fact, the fathers talk about the fall of Adam and Eve really being the fall of the nous. They say the focus of their soul was entirely on Christ and on pleasing him. And when the nous took its focus off of Christ and the fall officially happened, then it became natural in man's fallen state for the nous to be unfocused from God, which is why to focus on spiritual things and focus on pleasing Christ takes such force. And that's exactly why 1 minute you can be all zealous to follow Christ, live more ascetically, fast more, pray more, be at church, and 2 seconds later, what's that cartoon? Squirrel! Is that Up? Is that what that's from? That's what we're like all the time. The nous can't rest. Why can't it rest? Why are we so much more comfortable with the things of this world? I would argue to you that for the most part, it's not evil impulses that we have. It's not that we wish to be broken from Christ intentionally, but rather that we're being pulled by various desires, various interests, also various fears and anxieties. And these things make us really scattered. That means that we may be beset by sin and not even realize it because that state of being has become very normal for us. So what we need to do is realize it by understanding sin more deeply. And so for the rest of this particular talk, that's what I want to do. I want to talk about the aspects of sin and talk about what exactly makes us hold on to our sin in ways that we often don't realize. There are probably other reasons that I could add to these, but there are three that I want to focus on today. The first is that the heart is protecting wounds. We have particular wounds inside of us, and we're protecting those. The second is that the heart is guarding false loves that we don't want to get rid of. The third is that the heart has just simply become accustomed to sin. The nous is accustomed to distractions. It's just kind of how we are. And in all of these, I would argue that the root is egoism. Now again, with a lot of these terms, I'm going to give a little asides because I want to explain what I mean by these things. A lot of times I'll tell somebody that what's happening within them is rooted in egoism or in pride, and they kind of look at me with a little bit of surprise. And actually, the most recent example of this happened with my wife. Come to think of it, when I was taking these notes, I wasn't thinking about recording this. My wife, we'll find out if she's happy about this or not, but I'll get her permission. She had a little day where, surprise, surprise, she had some anger at the kids. And she's really, really trying to zero in on that and fix this and not react with anger towards the kids. I tell her all the time, as somebody who's done the same, that when we react to our kids with anger, we're not actually trying to correct their behavior. We're just simply expressing our own feelings, which is kind of useless. Because typically when our kids are throwing fits, we tell them, you need to control yourself and not do that. And yet here we are, by getting angry, just throwing a fit. It doesn't really work. And so I was telling her, this is really rooted in pride and egoism. And so I gave her a couple chapters to read that I give. Normally I don't act as the priest to my own wife. But I told her, I said, there's some readings that I give to a lot of parishioners on anger. Would you like to read it? And she said, yes, print it out for me. So I printed it out. And the author says that those who are beset by anger and can't control it are crazed in their pride. They've gone mad. And she goes, oh, so I'm crazy? I said, yes, I've been trying to tell you this for 13 years. No, of course not. I said, Lavinia, that's my wife's name. I said, Lavinia, egoism makes all of us crazy. This is the fathers define this. They say that when looking at mental illness, anybody who's not a saint is mentally ill. We're all mad because of egoism. Egoism is certainly the cause of it. She goes, but this isn't egoism. I said, you say that because you think that you don't feel great about yourself. And you're misunderstanding pride. Pride doesn't make you always walk around and think, I'm so great. That's not what pride is. Pride isn't to think yourself great. Pride is simply to be concerned with yourself, even at the expense of your relationship with Christ and others. And her face kind of went a little bit stoic for a second. And I noticed there was a little moment of a realization. All pride and egoism say, they don't say, I'm so great, I'm so important, I'm so much better than you. They can say that. Typically, what pride really says is, there is a me that needs to be protected, served, comforted, entertained, and massaged. And that me matters. And often, pride and egoism say these things without us even realizing it. That's all pride and egoism are. This is why it's the source of everything. Okay? So I just gave you three kind of sources for sin. Let's look at those and then see how pride relates to those. Okay? So first, I said the heart protects wounds. Why is it that a wounded and cornered animal is dangerous? Because that animal sees the world around it as a threat, and it's going to attack. For us, depending on how deep a wound is within the heart, we protect ourselves more or less vigorously and more or less thoughtlessly. Okay? So think about it with a physical analogy. It's one that I like to give a lot. If I come and just poke you in the arm, and your arm is not injured at all, that might be an annoyance, maybe it's funny, but you don't really care. If your arm has a bruise, and I come and poke it, you may recoil and say, ow, my arm's bruised, please don't do that. Well, what happens if you have a little bit of a fracture in your arm and I poke it? Well, now it really hurts. What happens if the bone inside of that arm is horribly fractured in multiple places. I'm going to come and poke it, and you're not even going to let me get close. You're going to stay away. My arm is severely injured. It really hurts. The whole point of this is the greater the wound, the more we protect ourselves. And even when the initial wound may heal, the memory of that pain causes us to remain in learned behaviors of protection. Same thing happens emotionally within the heart. Same thing happens to us. Self-protection causes us to lose sight of living for greater purpose, of serving God, of serving our neighbor, of seeking virtue. It really seeks to be protected at all costs. And often we enter into a mindset that's very much fight or flight. As soon as that wounded part of our heart is about to be poked, we go into that fight or flight mentality. We're either going to viciously respond or we're just going to run away. Think about this in practical senses. Maybe you heard that somebody's gossiped about you and slandered you. How might we respond? We could be shocked and disgusted, right? And we could start saying, oh, they think they're so great, and start talking about them. There's a wide-eyed recognition of the threat. Then with that anger and bitterness, as we start gossiping about them, what have we done? We've chosen to fight. That hurt me, and so I'm going to fight back. There's the fight response. Maybe we hear this gossip about us and we just fall into depression. We think, well, nobody likes me. And what do? We hyper-focus on ourselves and on how we feel. And we say, I just don't want to deal with this anymore, and we close in. There's flight. We've chosen to fly away from that. It doesn't matter if it's fight or flight. No matter what, it's concern for the self. So notice that self-protection can manifest itself in many different ways. It can be anger, it could be bitterness, holding grudges, it could be sadness and depression, it could be anxiety and fear, it could be a lot of different things. But it can also lead to another thing that we do when we have even bodily wounds. We do the same thing. The seeking of distraction. It's like one of my favorite strategies with my kids, by the way. My kids get hurt, and I know that they're not really that hurt. You can distract them very easily, and it gets them to realize, if I stop focusing on the fact that I just fell and hurt myself, it's really not too big of a deal. I can distract myself in a good way, but we can distract ourselves in negative ways too. So what do we do when we have this internal wound and we want to distract ourselves? Well, we search for constant comfort and entertainment. We have this obsession with distraction all the time. In extreme cases, we have addictions, sometimes self-harm. All those things are a response of us noticing a wound that has been poked and wanting to protect the self. We don't often think of this as, again, living in sin. But what's a common response today to stress and anxieties? Getting out your phone, going on YouTube or social media, and letting 4 or 5 hours pass without you even noticing. That's what's happening. You have a stress and anxiety, it doesn't feel good, you don't want to deal with it, and so you distract yourself. Look at how Christ dealt with threats to his ego. Well, he had no ego. He had no ego, and so he gives us the model of what it looks like to be free of this threat. It's not to say that he didn't display emotions, but when he displayed anger, for instance, at the Sadducees and Pharisees, it was for the benefit of others, not because he was trying to protect himself, not because he was personally hurt. He never protected his self-image. In physical threats, he would quietly avoid them. It would say he would pass through the midst of the crowd. We should recognize that as a great miracle. Can you imagine a mob trying to kill you and you're able to just pass through it and walk away? That's what it is. But again, it was for the benefit of others, because ultimately he accepted the mob. And then what does he do as he's being led out to crucifixion? He prays for them. No sense of protecting the self whatsoever. So some sin, just to reiterate this, rests in our heart because we are protecting ourselves from being wounded and exposed. Again, it doesn't necessarily feel like sin, but it causes us to focus on protecting ourselves rather than serving Christ and others. We become more self-focused. Okay, so there's one. The second, the heart is guarding or holding on to false loves. Well, the heart can be like a fist. You can go back to that last one, by the way, protecting wounds. What happens, I did a video on this recently, actually. What happens when you have a wound? You guard it really tightly. The problem with doing that is when the heart is deeply wounded, if you're holding on to that wound because you don't want it to be hurt, you've also blocked yourself from anything else good getting in, which means healing. The healing grace can't make itself into the heart. That's why healing is a little bit, we'll talk about this more in the next lecture, but healing can be painful. You have to expose yourself first. It takes a lot of trust in God. But it's the same thing with false loves. With false loves, we have certain things that we just really love. Okay? And we grip onto those things. And as long as that part of our heart is gripping onto that, it can't grip onto other things, which means Christ and others. That part of my heart is already taken. In order to grip onto Christ and others, I have to loosen my grip and let go. But the tighter our heart grips to those things, the more difficult it is for us to let go. Okay? Now, these false loves can be sinful in and of themselves, or they could be perfectly innocuous in and of themselves. Okay? So like a sinful thing could be like lust and pornography, a big problem for a lot of men today mainly. Our heart can be really grasping onto that. Or it can be things that really are not sinful in and of themselves. It could be, shopping and clothes and shoes. It could be food. No, not bad things in and of themselves. But when the heart grasps onto it and won't let go, now we've taken blessings and we've turned them sinful. Again, that heart is already dedicated and given over to other things. And so when that heart refuses to let go, it's not open to divine gifts and healing. A couple important points that can be made here. Number one, with that image, there's actually a little bit of a problem because it looks like it's the heart that's gripped on to the item that we love so much, or the thing that we love so much, the activity, the belief even, could be ideas. But because the heart is unable to loosen its grip, it's actually the other way around. It's that thing has gripped itself onto the heart, and we can't loosen it. We're actually enslaved at that moment. It's one of the things that when people talk about freedom, being able to do whatever you want, religion just enslaves you. Religion just wants to make you like a drone. I'd rather be free, think for myself, live for myself. I always ask two questions. There's two questions I ask. You think you're free? If it's a man, the first question I ask is, can you look at a beautiful woman and not have lust in your heart? Are you free to just say, today I'm not going to lust after women? If you can't, then you're not free. But my favorite question, the second one I ask is, can you simply by force of will love your enemies? Love those who hate you. Just decide one day, I've hated this person for years, but today I'm gonna love them. I'm gonna want what's best for them. I'm gonna be joyful at the thought of them. Can you do that by force of will? If not, are you really free? Are you really free? In both of these cases, what I'm actually describing is this very thing. Your heart is gripped onto something and it can't let go. You're not really free. You're actually enslaved. And then that second point, again, I've already made this, but notice that in some of these cases, your heart can be gripped onto things that are inherently sinful, and in some cases, they're gripped onto things that are not actually sinful in and of themselves, which is why often we don't recognize these things as sin. Again, you can have a perfectly good person because they don't do bad things, but their life is absolutely gripped onto certain things. They can't let go. In a well-ordered heart with those things that are not inherently sinful, we're so grateful to God for those blessings that all they do is simply point to Him and grow our love for Him. In a sinful state, They distract us from love for Christ in the first place. We become hyper-focused on them. So I want you to understand what this means. It means that the problem in our life is not whether or not we love. That's not the problem. Everybody has love in their heart. Everybody loves. The question is who or what we love. That's the more important question. And what this hopefully is helping you see is that our hearts are very divided. We think back to St. Paul saying, I do the things I don't want to do. I don't do the things I do want to do. Why? Well, because as much as Christ told us not to have two masters, I still have two masters. In fact, I have many masters. I probably have hundreds of masters in my heart. There's part of my heart that joyfully serves Christ. But there's a part of my heart that is really, really in love. And it's in love with my Tempur-Pedic mattress and pillow. And so at night I go, do I want to pray or do I want to reacquaint myself with my pillow? And we struggle over that because my heart is given over to that. So there's one example. Do we choose sleep over prayer? Do we choose meat and dairy over fasting days? Every time we do that, every time we choose not to fast, our heart is actually making a declaration of love. Our part of our heart is given over to comfort or food in a disordered slavery of love that holds that part of the heart back from Christ. It says, no, 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 this belongs to this. And again, it can be emotions, it can be ideas. I deal with that a lot. So many converts coming in, and some of them, the first time I meet with every single inquirer, I tell them, I give them what I call the world's worst sales pitch. And I end the world's worst sales pitch by saying, if you want to be here, you're here for one purpose. You are here to die every day. To die to your ideas, your thoughts, your impulses, your opinions, your will. You're here to die. Doesn't mean that everything you think and believe is wrong, but until you offer it to Christ and receive it back sanctified, you don't hold on to it. It's a tough ask. Christianity it's why we don't go door to door as Orthodox evangelists. It's hard to give that sales pitch. It's why I don't like a bumper sticker theology. I always tell people if your theology can fit on one bumper sticker, it's a little too simple for my taste. No, it's tough. Is it worthwhile? Yes, because what you get in return is actually much more beautiful than what you're holding on to. But because you love it, you have trouble letting it go. So again, every heart loves. And our heart has multiple masters who we love. And part of sin is that we just refuse to let go or be let go of by that particular thing. So a lot of these young guys who come in, I was saying, a lot of them have ideas. They have philosophies, either political or otherwise, that they don't want to let go of. And I tell them, this is not going to intermix. You have to let this go. Sometimes they choose to let it go, but I will tell you, sadly, I've had many leave the parish because they wouldn't let go of it. Every time I walked by them in the fellowship hall, they're talking politics. I told them, I never hear you talk about the scriptures, the lives of the saints, the hymns of the church, how much you love the church. Never hear you talk about Christ, the Panagia. You're always talking about the next conspiracy theory. Not going to fly. It doesn't work. Can you imagine when you have a visitor come in and the first thing they hear is some conspiracy theory? They're going to think, my goodness, why would I want to come? This is just as worldly a place as anywhere else. I've literally had guys tell me, then I guess I can't go here anymore. Walk out the door and never come back. Terrifying. Your hope is in the wrong things. So again, hopefully you can see here that at the root of this disorder is an insistence that our heart belongs to us rather than to Christ. And our heart should be ordered as we see fit. What does that mean? Egoism. Pride again. You see, egoism is the root of everything. So the part of the heart that is enslaved to the things of this life and held back for ourselves is then not given over to Christ. And certainly according to the world, this may feel and seem and look normal. But it still falls in that same category of what? Missing the mark. And therefore we would categorize it as living in darkness or living in sin. The third one, Our hearts are simply accustomed to sin. What do we mean by this? We mean that a passion has been born in the heart. A sin has been repeated or been modeled for us so much that it's become a normal part of life. The roots of that passion have dug deep into the heart, and we believe that they can't be separated. And you see this to the extent that people will identify with their sin. And you've probably heard people say this, and maybe you've said it. I know I shouldn't fill in the blank, but it's just who I am. That's just who I am. I can't help it. It's too much part of the heart. At this point, a part of the heart may become so dedicated to something that we don't even really love anymore or feel needs protected, but it's become so much a part of us that the immense work it would take to remove this from our heart gives us a lot of grief. It seems scary just to get rid of it, and so we say, forget it, I'm just going to leave it. It's just part of us. Again, the unwillingness to do work because it's just too uncomfortable, what's the culprit? The ego. The ego is always the culprit in this. I want you to understand in all of this that you'll notice there's a big difference between these related concepts of sinning and living in sin. They're related. The more we actively sin, the more living in sin becomes normalized for us. But you can live in sin without actively sinning. You can live separated from Christ with your life aimed in other directions and not be actively sinning and just accept that. And this is where I think that big divide comes. When we talk about sin, most of the world here is actively sin against, actively work against Christ. That's not what the Orthodox Church means to say that we live in sin. And that's the first part of the spiritual life anyway, is that we work to cease to actively sin. It's a part of it. It's a necessary part of it. But just because we've done well in that doesn't mean that we're satisfied. There's a lot more work to do. So let's draw some conclusions from what we've said so far. First, the illness of man, sin, is far more than simply doing something bad. So long as our heart is not entirely freed from passions, from material loves, from comforts and entertainments of this world, from self-protection and self-focus, we live apart from perfect love for Christ. And this is an illness in the Orthodox sense, and that's what we call sin. Second, sin goes far deeper in the heart of man. We have to go much further than simply not engaging with bad actions to completely and thoroughly cleanse the heart. It takes a lot more work than just not doing bad things. And third, just as sin is the root of all man's problems, so the ego is at the root of all of man's sins. Dealing with the ego is necessary. Look at every aspect of your spiritual life. Are we impatient? What are we really declaring when we say that we're impatient? How dare I have to be made to wait? I'm not so concerned that other people have to wait. I'm not concerned about them having to wait in a long line. I'm concerned that I have to wait in a long line. My time is more valuable. Are we gluttonous? I have hungers and desires for comfort that must be satiated. It's about me. Are we lustful? Other people's beauty exists to fulfill my pleasures. It's about me. Are we lazy? Our rest is more important than work that needs to be done or even what God calls us to. It's about me. Are we greedy? We want more for ourselves, not so that we can serve others better, not so that we can be more giving, but because I want more for me. It makes my life better. On and on and on. You can look at any sin, you can find that ego is the culprit. The heart wishes to guard itself, to hold on to things, its loves, and to continue in its ways rather than to undergo difficult and painful transformation. And spiritual life can be difficult and painful. And yet, as difficult as this transformation sounds, our Lord tells us what? Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The healing of man from sin is as painful or as comforting, as sorrowful or as joyful as we make it out to be. And this is why we must be good patients. So how can we be such good patients? That will be the subject of our second talk. So, with that understanding, hopefully a little bit of a broader understanding of what we mean by that simple word sin, without yet getting into the healing, because we'll talk a lot about that. Any questions? When there are no questions, it makes me very nervous, and it tells me that I either spoke very well or so terribly that no one knows what to say.
I think it's a lot to process the teaching that you're giving. So that's the sign.
What time is the second session?
Oh, could be at 11:30 or 12.
12. So you have 40 minutes or an hour and 10 minutes between that to process. So that's the time you have to process, and then we'll talk about the rest. We do have a question. Yes.
Speaking of self-protection and everything, all the words you're saying, but I'm curious about where trauma fits into that, and is that included in about some voluntary, right? So things that happen to us as witness we bring on ourselves that cause them to enable this.
Yep.
Is that what? Is that was when we see it?
Yeah. Okay. So the question is in talking about wounds within ourselves, especially when it comes to traumas. Does that relate to the idea of involuntary sins? And I would say, yeah, absolutely. I think that both voluntary and involuntary will play into effect there. And that's exactly why this concept is so important, because if we do see sin just as doing something bad, well, it makes a lot of sense why some people are bitter and angry. It makes a lot of sense why some people lash out when they're attacked. It makes a lot of sense why some people go into depressions. The Orthodox standpoint in saying, I'm not just satisfied with you saying you've been wounded, you've experienced trauma, and therefore I have understanding for you, and we'll just leave it at that. A lot of people view that as harsh. Say, but it's not my fault that I am the way I am. And my response is, no, it's not your fault. My goal is not to assign blame and fault involuntary sins. My goal is to bring you to healing. And so a lot of people, because again, we're self-focused, we hear, you need more healing. There's more things you need to do. And we go, but it's not my fault. I'm the one who was hurt. And the proper response is, yeah, I'm actually not really interested in placing blame right here. That's not really my interest. Now, we should have, ultimately the saints have a radical sense of their own sinfulness. St. Paul can call himself the chief of all sinners. He can look at the sin of the world and say, that's my fault. It'd be great to get there, but he got there because he was already being healed. And so that's more of my interest. And so what I tell people in those situations, when they say, Father, I know I'm like this, but look at everything that happened in my life. I feel like I can't help it. I go, I know. But can you picture a life of being free of that? A lot of times they'll tell me no, and then I'll bring up some lives of saints. And I'll say, well, let me tell you about some other saints who have experienced similar things and how they freed themselves of this. It is possible. So my goal isn't to sit there. It's like who goes to the doctor to have the doctor berate you for your illness? Nobody does that. You go because you want to be healed. Sometimes that berating needs to happen to snap you into reality. But I will tell you, in my priesthood, 13 years, I think it's 13 years. 13 years of a priest, I've done that twice in confession. Only twice have I had to look at somebody and say, okay, it's time for some tough medicine. Some priests have more of a personality like that, and they do that more often. It's just not I'm a big softie. But I will tell you, the last time I did it, the last time I was really tough on somebody, he stood up after the confession, he gave me a hug, and he said, thank you for taking my salvation so seriously. That was a good response. Those are the good days of being a priest. That was a good response. Did that answer what you're asking?
Yes, and it brought up
It's okay.
So, what I was going to say next to like, and where appreciate that. I was going to say like, so with involuntary sin and with decontamination, is this like God's mercy and grace is the solution because it's not something necessarily that cause an American. God's mercy.
Yeah. I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction probably than what you're expecting with this, but it's something I don't say in the second lecture, and I kind of want to say here. But the question, let me see, how do I summarize your question for the audio? I'd like to. Essentially, when some of these learned habits happen, is if they're involuntary sins and these are wounds that are often unexamined, is grace ultimately the healing factor? And okay, so. One of the things, because I have a little bit of a background in counseling, a lot of people will ask about the proper place of counseling and pastoral counseling, which are very different things. I'm not a big fan, admittedly, of a lot of psychotherapy and counseling today. I think that they've really gone in poor directions. I think there's philosophically a lot wrong with it, but I think it can be helpful. And typically what I tell people is this. The big difference between the healing method of the church and counseling is that counseling will see a wound. It'll see your arm bleeding, and it'll bind up that wound. That's a good thing. That's not bad. Grace actually seeks to heal the wound so it's not there at all in the first place. But many people aren't ready for that healing yet, and they need the counseling to help prepare them for it. That's where I think counseling can be very helpful. Ultimately, yes, grace is what heals. Grace heals in a way that no secular counseling ever can. Counseling will teach you how to cope better. It'll teach you how not to be so affected by your traumas. It can teach a lot of those things. But I tell people, if I can find good therapists, which is very hard, but when you can find good therapists, I tell them, do this. But there should be an end in sight. If you're going to therapy for 8 years about the same trauma, I don't think you're really benefiting as much as the cost is. Go for a brief time, bind up that wound a little bit, and then we'll start implementing some of these spiritual practices. Because until that point, sometimes the spiritual practices themselves can be traumatic for the person because they misinterpret them. So yes, the person needs grace, but you need to be able to approach God in the right way. And sometimes the fear of opening that wound is so great that actually they recoil and they go too far the other way. So there needs to be a balance there. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
So, in light of my Protestant background, and the way that our Orthodox faith views sin as illness, how do we view what Christ accomplished on the cross?
Yeah.
Christ sort of there to do it.
That's a big question. The question is in light of the idea of sin being an illness, how do we view Christ on the cross? I will answer this. Thank you. The ladybugs have overtaken my water. I'm glad I could feed them. I'm going to give a non-answer to this, and I'll tell you why I'm giving a non-answer. The non-answer to this is because this is actually the last video that I tried to film, and I've tried to film it twice, and I wasn't happy with the results both times, and so I've rewritten the script for it, and I'm waiting to find an hour to film it a third time. It's going to be an hour, which is what is salvation of the Orthodox Church. But here, I'll give you a little preview of it. One of the things that is problematic with saying that Christ died on the cross to forgive us of our sins is that Christ was already forgiving people of their sins while he was living. He could already do that. So the short answer about the cross, which is a large part of that script, is that the cross is not something that God was bound to, in the sense that if Christ didn't die on the cross, we couldn't be forgiven, we couldn't find reconciliation with God. God doesn't work that way, thank you. God can do whatever he wants, in whatever way he wants. So he chose the cross. It's a rare icon of the cross, but you can find sometimes one where Christ is on the cross, and what's leaning against the cross is a ladder. I love that. I love that. In fact, one of the things that I insist on all the time is that you must believe in a God who is so loving that if Adam and Eve had never fallen from paradise, that they were able to reproduce in some way. Everyone lived in paradise, and you alone fell from paradise. It was just you on your own. Christ would still have found a way to become incarnate, to die, and to be crucified for you. And of course, the question becomes, well, how would he be crucified? I'm not going to do it. I hope. He would do it. He would do it with tools. He would do it with a hammer, with nails, and a ladder. So the cross for us is first, yes, on the cross, sin was destroyed. This is the typical patristic answer. But it's interesting, the first 1,000 years of Christianity, look for patristic homilies on the cross. You don't really find them. Typically, when they talk about salvation, they talk about the incarnation, because that's what reunited divinity and humanity. So what is the cross first and foremost? It's the proof of Christ's self-sacrificing love for us. It's an image of love, first and foremost. And the meaning in it is what he imputed to it, not what he was required to do in order to save us. It's a very, very different view of the cross. That's part of why we kiss it. But again, I have an hour-long video that's going to be talking about this, and I don't want to keep you for an hour answering this question. Hopefully that at least makes some sense. Yes?
So I could be better winning arguments with my wife. When I'm having a conversation, and
Enthusiastic conversations.
you just said something that was significant with the previous question. When somebody says, it's not my fault, and you say, I'm not trying to place blame. And I've never thought about it from that perspective. I've always thought about it when I'm in a debate or vigorous debate, and I say it's not my fault. I've always been significant for me to make sure that blame doesn't rest on me.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never thought about it from a perspective of I'm not trying to place blame. Is there a follow up on that? Okay, I'm not trying to place blame, but now what?
Okay, so the question is in saying that if you're having a disagreement with somebody and you say it's not my fault, and you may respond with, or they say it's not my fault, you respond with, I'm not trying to place blame. Is there a follow up to that? Well, obviously it's going to depend on what you're talking about in the first place, and it's going to depend on your state and their state. If your state is one where you're beset by the passions, and there's righteous and unrighteous anger, and one of the good ways to decide if I'm living in unrighteous anger is to ask, am I in control of my anger? It's one of the things I tell, parents ask about spanking a lot, and this is kind of a side topic, but this is where I bring this up a lot. I'm not completely against the idea of spanking, but I tell parents, if you spank, you need to be in full control of yourself. It should be rare, but you need to be in full control of yourself. And if you are not, if your anger has taken over you, you are definitely not to spank that child or even touch them, because you're not in full control of yourself. That anger is now a passion, whereas anger should be used for healing. So I had this happen recently. Here's another story. This son is only 5, and so he won't care yet, but when he's older, he's going to love this story. My wife called me. I was driving home a couple weeks ago, and she called me, and she said, did you get, his name is Dometia. Did you get Dometia this little squishy shark for Christmas? This little squishy shark toy? And I said, no. And she goes, I think he stole it from the store today. He said he saw it, and he saw this toy, and he asked if we could have it. I said, no, it's too expensive. He's smart too, but not in like a kid smart way, not a very smart. So all day, she was like, I couldn't figure out why all day he kept saying, boy, Mom, good thing we didn't get that toy. It's just too expensive. We don't have that type of money. And he just wouldn't let it go, and she couldn't figure out why until she walked in his room and saw him playing with it. So I told her, I said, she goes, I'm mortified. I said, don't do anything. Don't do anything. So I went home, and I walked into the room, and he was already just looking ghost white. Dad's coming. Dun, 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 dun. And I said, Dometia, my wife couldn't find the tag for the toy. He took the tag off. No, this is my toy. Dad gave it to me. I said, where's the tag? In the garbage. I said, okay, let's get it. We're going to go to the store. You're going to tell them that you stole it. You're going to apologize, and we're going to pay for it. Completely stoic. What's the whole point? The whole point is I'm there to give him a lesson. That's what good parenting teaches. And so all this relates to, by the way, I'll tell you, this has nothing to do with it, but I'll tell you what happened then. As we're driving to the store, he goes, everyone's going to look at me and I'm going to be embarrassed. And I said, yeah, they are. And I said, and that probably should happen. And he just goes, okay. And so I'm just praying that of the people who are working there that night, not all of them are women. The store has mainly women who are cashiers. I want a big, scary-looking man. This is going to really... And there's one guy working there. And I said, okay, Dometia, go. He goes, I stole this! And he's crying. And I said, and you're what? And he goes, and I'm sorry! And of course, all the women come over. Oh, poor guy. It's no! That's not the point of this. No compassion yet. He'll never do it again. Anyway, what is the point of all this? The point is that you have to look at the particular scenario. And in some cases, taking responsibility is really important. And looking at somebody and saying, this, it's not about placing blame, but it is about taking responsibility. Now, in a discussion with your wife, I don't know that it's your job to instruct at that point. It's your job to display more than anything.
Well, I'm usually...
Okay, but you're the husband, so it usually is your fault. if when it's not about blame, we need to go, especially in marriages, we need to go into, and this is where the relationship between men and women is really important. Women tend to be more emotionally intelligent, men tend to be fixers, more Mr. Fix-It. And a lot of times that creates a lot of conflict in the marriage. But I tell married couples, no, that's a beautiful mystery of marriage. If anything, it should complement one another. And so that's where it's a good point for men to take over. And the men should say this: what is the goal that we're trying to get to with this conversation? And how can we get to that goal? So when we fight in marriages, typically there's a lot of blame being placed, but that blame isn't with any purpose. And that's where we run into the problem. And so if you're blamed, it's your fault. I think the first reaction is to take that step back and say, okay, what are we trying to aim towards here? And is this blame useful? Is it useful to give blame or to accept blame in this right now? If it's not, then you say, that's not really what we're talking about. If it is, then humbly take it. And sometimes if it's not your fault, humbly take it anyway. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next lecture. So you have to know, what is the goal here? And there's going to be different methods based on what the situation is. The reason I'm giving kind of that vague answer is because the reality is that in most cases, humility is a great healing balm, but not in every case. I was shocked when I read this in St. Sophrony of Essex. One of my favorite books is called I Know a Man in Christ. It's a great book about the theology life of St. Sophrony of Essex. In the second half, Metropolitan Hierotheus, the author, he just gives conversations that he had with St. Sophrony and everything that he was told. I was shocked when I read this. St. Sophrony says, it's not right in every circumstance to display humility. He says, with the humble, you can be humble, and that's beneficial. But with those who are going to take advantage of your humility and their sin will increase and you'll be abused, nobody's being helped. And at that point, it's right to put humility away. I was really surprised when I read that. I thought he was going to say, be humble in every circumstance. So it depends on the circumstance. And you have to look at it and say, what's going to be useful here? What's the goal we're working towards, and what's going to help us get towards that goal? Hopefully that helps.
Can you give an example of what St. Sophrony says like that?
An example of not being humble?
Yes, because it would be bad for...
Sure. If somebody has, Father and I have been talking about this a lot, if somebody has a deep victimization mentality and they use that to gin up sympathy and to seek help all the time, a lot of times your help at that point is not helping anymore. It's actually helping deepen their reliance on other people when they can actually learn life skills that are actually going to be much more helpful. So I've had times in ministry where I've had to look at somebody and say, I know this is what you want from me. No. I can't put my own impulses and ideas away right now and just do what you want, because I don't think that's going to be helpful to you. I think it's actually going to make things worse. Yes.
What's the appropriate level of patience to have with ourselves in regards to passions? I feel like there's a fine line between
Yeah. It's a good question.
being accepting that you can't accomplish something right away.
Yeah.
Being
Yeah. So what's the acceptable level of like pushing we should do when it comes to our own passions and patience? And what I would suggest here is that first of all, you need to recognize the passion and recognize what the corresponding virtue is and what you're working towards. That's where reading the lives of the saints is very helpful. What does this virtue look like when it's lived? What does the gospel written in the heart look like? And then what you do is working with your spiritual father, you say, what's one step I can take in that direction? Just one millimeter of progress that I can make. And I tell people that the spiritual life is always a balance. And the balance is you step one little millimeter into discomfort and you stay there and practice that until it becomes comfortable. And then you do it again, and then you do it again, and then you do it again. And over the course of months and years, you'll be able to see that you made a great deal of progress. Christ isn't going to let you see great progress right from the start. It's really dangerous if you make a lot of progress immediately, because then what do? Oh, I'm so capable. I'm so great. Well, now you've increased pride and you've made yourself worse. So typically, I tell people, it's good to give yourself an examination every single day, a spiritual examination. You do your evening prayers, you look at your day, ask forgiveness of the areas where you need to ask forgiveness, ask Christ for strength to do better the next day. But otherwise, I tell people, don't spy on yourself. So again, straight from St. Sophrony, don't spy on yourself. Don't sit there and examine your spiritual life and try to gauge it all the time. It's not healthy. What happens when you gauge your own spiritual life? There's two conclusions you can come to. Either I'm doing great, pride, or I'm not making any progress, despair. It's better just to say, how can I love Christ a little bit more today and struggle in that area? And then what I tell people is every now and then give yourself a 6-month or year-long examination. Say, okay, compared to 6 months ago, how am I doing? Compared to a year ago, how am I doing? I tell this story a lot in my parish where a few years ago I came across a box full of my old seminary notes. And I started flipping through them. I was reading the questions that I was concerned with them and the thoughts I had. And I went, what an idiot. Who is this guy? I didn't recognize it. And I went, oh, thank God. That means I must have made some progress. So this is like my test for me, is when I can look at my own homilies from a year ago and go, moron, then I go, oh, I must have learned something. Something went well. So every now and then, look 6 months or a year ago and say, okay, if you're not making progress, then you need to come and say, Father, I really need help in reestablishing a better plan for this because I'm not making progress. But hopefully what will happen is you'll be surprised and you go, my goodness, that sin for me on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being like it defined me, 1 being it wasn't existent, I was like at an 8.5 a year ago. Now I'm at a 7. 7 may not be great, but it's better than an 8.5, which means I'm going in the right direction. So why mess with progress? So find the level of discomfort just over the line of where you are, stay there, practice it until it becomes comfortable, and then keep doing that every day, every week. Let's do. Yeah, go for it.
When you're talking about holding on to something you really want and then letting it go and giving it to God, and if it returns to you, then it's something that you have.
Yeah, I was talking about ideas in that sense, like ideas, maybe philosophical beliefs. I was saying that we offer everything to God and crucify it. We crucify it, offer it to Christ, and then some things we can take it back, but take it back sanctified. And so, for instance, there are philosophical concepts that people sometimes come into the church with. And some of those are okay, but they still need to be baptized. They need to be baptized. So instead of us deciding what I'm going to crucify and offer to Christ and what not to, well, that takes discernment, which we don't have. Let's be honest. We really don't have good discernment. So it's better simply to take it and say, I want to crucify everything. And the way you do that is, again, I'm a big proponent of always being reading a life of a saint, because the life of the saints are the Gospels written in the heart and enlivened. And so when you can compare your life against your ideas against theirs, eventually what you'll notice after years of doing this is, boy, I have this certain approach that I can't find anywhere in the lives of the saints. Maybe this really doesn't work so well. Or I have this idea that I never find there. Or I have an idea that you can find, but they're not as obsessed with it as I am. For me, it's everything, and those can be problematic. Those can be really problematic. So it's funny because with all the converts that we're seeing, a lot of them after a year, they'll tell me that without realizing it, their political outlets, people are obsessed with politics in all the wrong ways. It's just really bad. But they'll tell me that their entire political outlook has completely altered and they didn't even realize it. Now I'm not focused on their political outlook. I don't really care that much, but I'm glad to see that things change without them realizing it. And you get these guys who come in, a lot of them are like super libertarian. They're like, government should basically not exist. And a year later, they're like, man, I wish we could have an Orthodox king in this country. Like that's a huge shift. Now, again, I don't really care either way. But what it tells me is that they weren't so attached to their ideology. Some of them, however, are. Some are so attached to their ideas. And if they find saints who disagree with their ideas, then it must be the saint who's wrong because they're just so sure they're right. That's dangerous. That's really dangerous. Yes, let's do just a couple more.
So my question is we talk about, sin as not doing bad stuff, what's wrong with that? How would you define then what is righteousness or being perfect as Jesus?
That is what we will discuss in the next talk.
Way to go, Ryan.
No, he led us straight to it. All right, should we do one more? That's what I think every time I open my mouth.
My question is about fight or flight and releasing the grip on that trauma.
Mhm.
So let's say that there's someone in one's life that they have to deal with on a regular basis, and that person has caused hurt, and I'm stuck in two places. Christ said when he sent the apostles out, if you're not, I forget the exact words, I'm paraphrasing horribly, so forgive me, but if they're not receiving you, take the dust off your feet and walk away.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, there's that desire to open the fist, open my heart, and forgive and be as Christ. So, if I do that, then I'm forgiving and I'm loving, and regardless of what could possibly happen, even if I know I could be hurt again, possibly. So that's easy for me,
yeah.
but as a mother, okay, so now I have to protect children.
Yep.
And am I modeling by holding on, by protecting, by staying in that fight or flight space,
Mm-hmm.
and that protected, having my fist closed around this situation? Am I exemplifying to my children? There's a time and a place for protection where we hold that grip so tightly, or do I open it and I exemplify God is in charge, and sometimes we have to face these situations.
Yeah. Okay, so the question has to do with when we're in relationships of different types and the fight or flight response, and when to know when to open the heart, when to know when to take a step back. I mean, there's like a lot of complications within this, and how do we know what to do when? Essentially, is that kind of?
So it's more about like exemplifying as a parent.
Yeah, as a parent, especially. Okay.
Especially as a parent.
Okay. The first thing I'd say here is, I think we run into a big problem when we look at the problem as one that needs to be solved. Because especially when it comes to relationships, children or anybody else, sometimes there are problems that aren't going to be solved, they're just going to be managed well. And if you view it in terms of it's either solved or it's a problem, you fall into despair because you feel like I'm never going to get to solved. Well, don't make that the goal then. That's ultimately, it's not the goal. Of course, it's the ultimate goal, we could say, but while we're dealing with other people, we can't control them, even with kids. One of the one of the simple piece of advice here is what Saint Porfirio says, which is we should speak to God about our children far more than we speak to our children about God. It's one of my favorite little lines, and it works. It works. Okay. However, especially as they get older, and there's a lot going on, I tell people that we need to be led by three things: humility, love, and wisdom. And sometimes one needs to be held up more than the other. You see this in the life of Christ. Christ always had humility, love, and wisdom, and yet sometimes he put humility away. I remind people, yes, he loved everyone perfectly, and people typically think of the disciples or those who had needed miracles for some physical malady. But it's also true of the scribes and Pharisees and the money changers. He loved them perfectly. And yet their behavior and their mindset needed to be shaken up, and sometimes they were going to receive it and sometimes not. And other times, sometimes he spent a lot of time with somebody, other times he walked out from the midst of them. So what is Christ doing there? In simple language today that we would use in counseling, he's setting up boundaries. And boundaries need to be set up. One of the things I talk about it too a lot is the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Those are very different things. I can forgive somebody but not be reconciled with them because they've done. So, for instance, if let's say this morning I went into Father's room and I found $50 and I stole it from him. Now, if I look at him and say, "Please forgive me," he may forgive me, but we're not reconciled yet because I still have that $50. If I'm really sorry, I'm going to give it back. So what is he going to do? He's going to set up boundaries. He's going to say, "My brother, I love you. You are not staying at my house anymore." And that's going to be very understandable. Or and charge me, you had it for an hour and a half, 8% interest. So obviously these get very complex very quickly. And knowing how to balance humility, love, and wisdom changes in every circumstance. And that's where going to a spiritual father is going to be helpful. One of the, I don't know if I have this line in my second talk or not, so I'll give it now. Maybe I'll ruin it. But there is one line, I have some mantras that my parishioners are sick of hearing, but I give them all the time. And one of the mantras I give is, don't worry about the fact that you're struggling. Worry about whether you're struggling well. Very different mindset. And so what does struggling well in this situation look like? Go to a spiritual father. And if I can say one scandalous thing to end, I'll end with a scandalous thing. As much as I love reading the lives of saints, you know what my biggest problem with reading Lives of Saints is? Very few of them discuss the struggles that led to the holiness that you read about in the books. Some of them do, but I wish more of them would focus on the imperfections. I know they're written mainly, especially the hagiographies, for inspiration. Those are great, but sometimes I wish that they would talk about, like St. Mary of Egypt. Thank God we read that every single year in church for a reason, because it doesn't hide anything about how she was living. And I think that we need a little bit more of that to learn, how do I struggle well in this situation? Because again, not every situation, when we're dealing with other people, not every situation is going to have a perfect solution. And you have to find out, what boundaries do I need to set and how strongly do I need to hold those boundaries? It's just part of life, unfortunately. So I have people in my life who I forgive and I pray for and I love them, but I only want to love them from a distance, because I know that when we get into contact with each other, there's going to be more problems. It's just going to increase the sin, probably on both sides, honestly. Mine too. I don't want to increase resentment, so I have to keep them at that distance. There are probably people who feel that way about me, honestly. It's probably people who feel that way about all of us. We have to be a little bit humble and accept, yeah, we're the problem too. But if we're trying to lead with humility, love, and wisdom, and it's not going well, go to your spiritual father, explain the situation, and find out, what does struggling well in this situation look like? Not just well for you, but well for everybody involved. And sometimes that takes very difficult decisions. It can be very painful. On that happy note, let's end for this one, and we'll meet whenever we meet and do session 2.